June 6, 1944, 0900 hours. Omaha Beach, Normandy, France. A 21-year-old medic named Waverly Woodson waded through chest-deep water toward the most heavily defended beach in Nazi-occupied Europe. Blood streamed down his legs. Shrapnel had torn open his thigh, his buttocks, his back. The soldier next to him was dead. His landing craft was destroyed. Any rational person would have sought medical help. Any reasonable soldier would have found cover and waited for evacuation. Waverly Woodson did neither. Instead, he grabbed his medical bag and ran toward the sound of screaming men. For the next 30 hours, while bleeding from multiple wounds, he would save more than 200 lives. He would amputate limbs, pull drowning men from the sea, perform battlefield surgery under machine gun fire. And when it was all over, when he finally collapsed from blood loss and exhaustion, the United States Army would give him nothing. No Medal of Honor, no Distinguished Service Cross, not even acknowledgement that he had been there. This is the story of America's forgotten hero, a man who proved that courage knows no color, but recognition apparently does. To understand what Waverly Woodson did on D-Day, you first need to understand who he was before the war. Born August 3, 1922 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Waverly Bernard Woodson Jr. grew up in a working-class neighborhood where his father worked as a mail carrier. He was a brilliant student, the kind of young man who everyone knew was destined for something greater. After graduating from Overbrook High School, he enrolled at Lincoln University in Oxford, Pennsylvania, one of the few universities that accepted black students. He studied pre-med. His dream was to become a doctor, to heal people, to make a difference. Then, December 7, 1941 happened. Pearl Harbor changed everything. Like millions of young Americans, Woodson felt the call to serve. But unlike many of his white classmates who saw military service as a path to glory and adventure, Woodson knew exactly what he was getting into. This was 1942. America was fighting a war against fascism overseas while practicing segregation at home. The military itself was segregated. Black soldiers served in separate units, often relegated to support roles, rarely given the chance to prove themselves in combat. Woodson knew all this. He enlisted anyway. On December 15, 1942, in his sophomore year, Waverly Woodson and his younger brother Eugene walked into an Army recruitment office and signed up. They wanted to fight evil. They believed Nazi Germany represented a threat to the entire world, and they were willing to give their lives to stop it, even if their own country did not see them as equals. What happened next reveals everything about America in 1942. Woodson took an aptitude test for officer candidate school, the program that trained military leaders. He scored exceptionally high. In a fair system, this would have fast-tracked him to officer training and eventually a commission. But the Army had quotas for black officers, and even those who made it through faced a rule that prevented them from commanding white soldiers, even those junior to them. Woodson passed the exam. He qualified for officer candidate school in the anti-aircraft artillery. He was one of only 2 African Americans accepted. Then, just before completing the program, he received devastating news. There were no positions available for him in the Coast Artillery Corps, not because he lacked ability, not because he failed any test, but because of the color of his skin. The Army needed officers. Woodson was qualified, but he was black. So instead of leading soldiers, he was retrained as a combat medic. This was not the disappointment it might seem. Woodson still had his dream of helping people, of saving lives. If he could not heal as a doctor, he would heal as a medic. And so he was assigned to the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion, training at Camp Tyson in Paris, Tennessee. The 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion was unique in the American military. It was one of only 4 all-black barrage balloon units trained at Camp Tyson. To understand their mission, you need to know what barrage balloons were. These were large hydrogen-filled balloons, about 35 feet in length, tethered to the ground by steel cables. They flew at altitudes up to 2,000 feet. Their purpose was defensive. Enemy aircraft trying to strafe or bomb ground positions would have to fly higher to avoid the cables, which would foul their aim and make them vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire. Some balloons even had small explosive charges attached to their cables. If an enemy plane hit a cable, the explosion could damage or destroy the aircraft. It sounds simple, but operating these balloons required extraordinary skill. The men had to learn how to inflate them with highly flammable hydrogen gas, Without creating sparks that would ignite an explosion, they had to camouflage them, repair them under fire, handle them in all weather conditions. The training lasted 18 weeks, 6 weeks of basic balloon handling, then 12 weeks of weather forecasting, because these balloons were extraordinarily vulnerable to wind and storms. The 320th trained hard. They knew their mission would be dangerous. What they did not know was that they would make history. In November 1943, the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion shipped out to England. For months they trained in the British countryside, preparing for an invasion everyone knew was coming but no one could talk about. The men of the 320th faced discrimination, even in England, though they found British civilians far more welcoming than many white American soldiers. Some white American officers tried to enforce segregation in British pubs and towns. The British largely ignored these orders. The 320th continued their training. They refined their techniques. They prepared for the largest amphibious invasion in human history. And then, in early June 1944, they received their orders. The 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion would be part of the first wave landing on Omaha and Utah beaches. They would be the only African-American combat unit to storm the beaches on D-Day. This was unprecedented. In a military where black soldiers were usually relegated to support roles, driving trucks and loading supplies, the 320th would be landing alongside white infantry in the first hours of the invasion. Their mission was critical. They had to get those hydrogen-filled balloons off the ships and into the air before German aircraft could strafe the landing forces. Men from the battalion would take part in the assault. 5 medics would land in the first wave. Waverly Woodson was one of them. The night of June 5, 1944, Waverly Woodson boarded landing craft tank 856. The English Channel was rough. Waves crashed over the sides of the landing craft. Men vomited from seasickness. Woodson felt the nausea too, but he focused on his job. He checked his medical supplies: bandages, morphine, sulfur powder, plasma, tourniquets, surgical instruments, everything a combat medic would need to save lives under fire. As the craft approached the French coast in the pre-dawn darkness, German coastal defenses opened fire. Artillery shells screamed overhead. Machine gun fire raked the water. Then, somewhere in the darkness, landing craft tank 856 struck a mine. The explosion was catastrophic. The vessel lost power. As it drifted toward shore, pushed by the tide, a German 80mm shell struck the craft. The shell killed the man standing next to Woodson. Shrapnel tore through the landing craft like a swarm of angry hornets. Woodson felt burning pain across his body. Shrapnel had ripped into his groin, his inner thigh, his buttocks, his back. Blood poured from his wounds. For a moment, Woodson thought he was dying. The pain was overwhelming. The landing craft continued drifting toward the beach, powerless, while German guns pounded it. Of the 26 Navy personnel aboard, only 1 survived. The Germans methodically murdered the crew, raking the entire top of the ship with machine gun fire. Then they started with mortar shells. Waverly Woodson was wounded, bleeding, possibly dying. He had not even reached the beach yet. The landing craft finally grounded on Omaha Beach around 09:30 hours. Woodson forced himself to move. Pain exploded through his body with every step, but he knew that staying in the landing craft meant death. He grabbed his medical bag and stumbled into the surf. The water was red with blood. Bodies floated everywhere. Wounded men screamed for help. German machine guns continued firing from the bluffs above, kicking up geysers of water and sand. This was the moment that would define Waverly Woodson's life. He was wounded. He was bleeding. He was in shock. Any reasonable person would have sought treatment, found cover, tried to survive. Instead, Woodson looked at the carnage around him and made a choice. He would do his job. He would save lives. His own wounds did not matter. He ran up the beach, moving from man to man, assessing injuries, applying tourniquets, administering morphine, stopping bleeding. The Germans continued firing. Mortar shells exploded around him. Bullets whipped past. Woodson ignored it all. He worked with mechanical efficiency, treating the most severe wounds first, moving to the next patient, saving lives one at a time. Then something happened that defied belief even in the chaos of D-Day. 4 men were drowning in the surf, dragged down by their equipment in the undertow. Their screams for help were barely audible over the sound of gunfire and explosions. Waverly Woodson, already wounded and bleeding, ran back into the water. Machine gun fire raked the surf. Woodson did not care. He reached the first man, cut away his equipment, dragged him to shore, then he went back. He pulled out a second man, then a third, then a fourth. Each time he risked his life. Each time German guns tried to kill him. Each time he succeeded. The exact number of men he saved from drowning remains uncertain, with sources varying between 3 and 4. But what is certain is that Waverly Woodson ran into machine gun fire to pull drowning soldiers from the sea. While he himself was bleeding from multiple shrapnel wounds, this was not courage. This was something beyond courage. This was a man so committed to his mission, so focused on saving lives, that his own survival became irrelevant. As the morning wore on, Woodson established a makeshift aid station in a crater created by German artillery. It offered minimal protection, but it was better than nothing. Wounded men began crawling or being carried to his position. Woodson worked without stopping. He applied pressure bandages to sucking chest wounds. He administered plasma to men in shock. He splinted broken bones. He cleaned and dressed burns. And then, in perhaps his most remarkable act, he performed an amputation under fire. A soldier had been hit by mortar shrapnel. His right foot was hanging by threads of tissue and bone. The man was losing blood rapidly. Without immediate intervention, he would die. Woodson had no surgical team, no operating room, no anesthesia beyond morphine. Just his medical training, his instruments, and his will. He completed the amputation, probably saving the soldier's life. All while German artillery continued to pound the beach. All while machine gun fire continued to rake the sand. All while his own wounds bled and his own strength ebbed away. For 30 hours, Waverly Woodson worked. Other medics collapsed from exhaustion. Woodson kept going. His bandages became soaked with his own blood. He changed them and kept going. His hands shook from blood loss and fatigue. He steadied them and kept going. Men died despite his efforts. He closed their eyes and moved to the next patient. He treated more than 200 wounded soldiers in those 30 hours. White soldiers, black soldiers, officers, enlisted men, Americans, British. He never asked about race or rank. He asked, "Where are you hurt? How can I help?" Finally, after 30 hours of continuous work, Waverly Woodson's body gave out. He collapsed from blood loss, exhaustion, and shock. Other medics, recognizing what he had done, immediately began treating him. They bandaged his wounds properly. They gave him plasma. They prepared him for evacuation. When the doctors examined him, they were astonished he had remained conscious, much less functional, for so long. They recommended him for evacuation to England and then home. His war, they said, was over. He had done more than enough, but Waverly Woodson had different ideas. He recovered in England, his wounds healed, and then he did something that revealed the depth of his character. He requested to return to his unit. The doctors tried to talk him out of it. He had earned his ticket home. He had proven his courage beyond any doubt. But Woodson was adamant. His unit was still in France. His brothers were still fighting. He belonged with them. The army, perhaps embarrassed by his insistence or simply recognizing that they could not stop him, granted his request. For 140 days, the 320th operated in France. They protected bridges, supply depots, and headquarters from German air attacks. Their balloons flew day and night, forcing Luftwaffe pilots to fly higher, making them easier targets for Allied anti-aircraft guns. The unit performed brilliantly. General Dwight Eisenhower himself praised their contribution. The Supreme Allied Commander noted that the 320th had demonstrated the same courage and professionalism as any unit in the European theater. At Utah Beach, 175 balloons went up within hours of the landing. At Omaha, the conditions were more difficult, but the 320th still managed to deploy 40 balloons under fire. These balloons remained operational throughout the Normandy campaign, protecting Allied forces as they fought inland. German pilots learned to avoid the balloon barriers. Those who did not paid the price. Several Luftwaffe aircraft were downed by balloon cables or by anti-aircraft fire when forced to higher altitudes. The 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion had done what no one thought a black unit could do. They had landed in the first wave of D-Day. They had operated under the worst combat conditions. They had performed their mission flawlessly. And they had proven beyond any doubt that courage and competence had nothing to do with the color of a soldier's skin. But while the 320th as a unit received some recognition, Waverly Woodson received none. His commanding officer, a white captain named William Adair, recommended him for the Medal of Honor. The recommendation worked its way up the chain of command. General John C. H. Lee, commanding general of the Services of Supply in the European theater, endorsed it. Lee was known for his support of African American soldiers. He believed Woodson's actions on Omaha Beach warranted the nation's highest military honor. But somewhere between General Lee's desk and Washington, the recommendation disappeared. Some accounts suggest it was downgraded to a Bronze Star. Others say it simply vanished into the bureaucracy. What is certain is that Waverly Woodson, who had saved more than 200 lives while bleeding from his own wounds, received nothing, not the Medal of Honor, not the Distinguished Service Cross, not even immediate recognition of the Bronze Star that was supposedly approved. The contrast with white medics who performed similar actions is stark. Consider Desmond Doss, the Seventh-day Adventist who refused to carry a weapon but served as a combat medic in the Pacific. Doss saved 75 men during the Battle of Okinawa, lowering them down a cliff face under fire. For this, he received the Medal of Honor. His heroism was extraordinary and the medal was absolutely deserved. But Doss saved 75 men. Woodson saved more than 200. Doss worked for hours under fire. Woodson worked for 30 hours while wounded. Yet Doss became a national hero, the subject of books and movies, while Woodson remained unknown. The pattern repeated across the military. Of the 464 Medals of Honor awarded for actions in World War II, not one went to a black soldier. Not one. This was not because black soldiers lacked courage. The historical record proves otherwise. The Tuskegee Airmen, the 761st Tank Battalion, the 92nd Infantry Division, and dozens of other black units performed with extraordinary valor. But valor alone was not enough. The medal required documentation, eyewitness accounts, and command endorsement. In a segregated military, those supporting elements often disappeared. Commanders who supported black soldiers found their recommendations blocked. Eyewitness accounts from white soldiers were often not solicited or ignored. And crucially, the men making final decisions about medals were products of their time, steeped in the casual racism that permeated American society. The result was a systematic denial of recognition that persisted for decades. In 1997, 52 years after the war ended, President Clinton attempted to correct this historical wrong. The Army had conducted a study examining why no black soldiers had received the Medal of Honor for World War II. The study concluded that discrimination was the primary factor. Clinton held a ceremony on January 13, 1997, awarding the Medal of Honor to 7 black soldiers for World War II actions. Only one, Vernon Baker, was still alive to receive it. The others received it posthumously, but Waverly Woodson was not among them. His name was not in the study. His actions on Omaha Beach remained buried in lost paperwork and fading memories. The Army study had focused primarily on infantry actions. Medics, especially those whose recommendations had been lost or destroyed, were not systematically reviewed, and so the injustice continued. Waverly Woodson returned home from the war. He had saved more than 200 lives. He had served with honor and courage beyond measure. He had proven everything a soldier could prove, and America rewarded him with silence. His post-war life reveals both his character and the broader tragedy of black veterans returning to a still segregated America. Woodson used the GI Bill to complete his degree at Lincoln University, graduating in 1950. He then attended graduate school, studying medical technology. He married Joanne in 1952. Together, they built a life and raised 3 children. Woodson worked at the National Naval Medical Center in Bethesda, Maryland. He later transferred to the National Institutes of Health, where he worked from 1959 to 1980 as a medical technician and supervisor. He became an expert in hematology. He trained countless other technicians. He contributed to medical research that saved lives. In civilian life, just as in war, Waverly Woodson dedicated himself to healing and helping others. He spoke rarely of his war experiences. His family knew he had served on D-Day, but he did not dwell on it. He did not campaign for recognition. He did not write memoirs or seek publicity. This was not because he was bitter or because he had forgotten. It was because, for Waverly Woodson, doing the right thing was its own reward. The medals would have been nice. The recognition would have been just, but their absence did not diminish what he had done or who he was. Occasionally, he would share stories with fellow veterans or speak to school groups about the war. Those who heard him speak remembered his humility. He did not portray himself as a hero. He talked about the other medics, the soldiers he treated, the men who died despite his best efforts. He spoke with respect about his white officers who had tried to get him recognized. He expressed pride in the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion and their accomplishments, but he never complained about the lack of medals. He never expressed anger at the injustice. Some might see this as passivity, but those who knew Waverly Woodson understood it differently. He had proven himself on Omaha Beach. He knew what he had done. He knew the lives he had saved. The recognition of his country would have been meaningful, but its absence did not change the fundamental truth. He had been there. He had done the work. He had saved lives. That was enough. In 1994, the French government invited surviving members of the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion to France for the 50th anniversary of D-Day. The French, unlike the Americans, had not forgotten the black soldiers who landed on their beaches. Waverly Woodson attended. He walked the sands of Omaha Beach again, now 71 years old, remembering the young man he had been. The French honored him and his comrades. They received medals and recognition. They were celebrated as liberators. For one brief moment, Waverly Woodson experienced what should have been his due 50 years earlier, but it was bittersweet. Most of his comrades from the 320th were gone. The men he had treated on the beach were gone. The young medic who had run through machine gun fire to save drowning soldiers was long gone, replaced by an old man with memories and scars. Woodson returned to America. He continued his quiet life. He watched his grandchildren grow. He celebrated his 50th wedding anniversary with Joanne, and on August 12, 2005, Waverly Bernard Woodson Jr. died at the age of 83. He died without ever receiving the Medal of Honor. He died without national recognition of his heroism. He died as he had lived, with dignity and grace, asking for nothing. But death was not the end of Waverly Woodson's story. In the years following his passing, a small group of historians, veterans, and advocates began piecing together the evidence of what he had accomplished. Linda Hervieux, a journalist, spent 6 years researching her book, Forgotten: The Untold Story of D-Day's Black Heroes, published in 2015. Her meticulous research brought Waverly Woodson's story back to light. She interviewed surviving members of the 320th. She scoured archives. She found the lost recommendation for the Medal of Honor. She documented the systematic discrimination that had denied recognition to black soldiers. Her work created the foundation for everything that followed. Senator Chris Van Hollen of Maryland, where Woodson had lived most of his adult life, took up the cause in 2015. Van Hollen introduced legislation to award Woodson the Medal of Honor. The bill gained bipartisan support. Military historians testified to Woodson's heroism. Veterans organizations endorsed it, but the bill faced a bureaucratic obstacle that seemed insurmountable. The Medal of Honor requires extensive documentation, eyewitness accounts, after-action reports, command endorsements, medical records. For Waverly Woodson, much of this documentation was missing. Some had been lost in the chaos of war. Some had been destroyed in the catastrophic fire at the National Personnel Record Center in St. Louis in July 1973, which destroyed 80% of Army personnel records from World War II. The missing documentation became a convenient excuse for inaction. In August 2020, the Army approved Woodson for the Combat Medical Badge, an award created in 1945 but not made available to most World War II medics retroactively. It was a small recognition, decades overdue, but it represented official acknowledgement that Woodson had served in combat. The actual presentation did not occur until October 11, 2023, when Woodson's widow, Joanne, then 93 years old, received the badge on his behalf at Arlington National Cemetery. The ceremony was emotional. Joanne Woodson, who had fought for her husband's recognition for nearly 2 decades after his death, finally saw the Army acknowledge what he had done. It was not the Medal of Honor. It was not even the Distinguished Service Cross, but it was something. It was the Army saying, "We see you. We acknowledge your service. We recognize your sacrifice." For Joanne Woodson, it was bittersweet. Her husband deserved more. He deserved the recognition in his lifetime. But she was grateful that his story was finally being told. that his name was finally being remembered. Then on June 3, 2024, the Department of Defense announced that Waverly Woodson would receive the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest military decoration for valor. The announcement came 79 years and 362 days after Woodson's actions on Omaha Beach. The actual ceremony took place on September 24, 2024, at the White House. Joanne Woodson, now 94 and in fragile health, attended. So did Woodson's children and grandchildren. President Biden presented the medal, speaking about the courage Waverly Woodson had demonstrated and the injustice of his long wait for recognition. The ceremony was covered by national media. Finally, 8 decades later, America was beginning to acknowledge what Waverly Woodson had done. The Distinguished Service Cross is a significant honor. Only the Medal of Honor ranks higher. It recognizes extraordinary heroism in combat. For Waverly Woodson to receive it was meaningful and important. But even as his family celebrated this recognition, they continued pushing for the Medal of Honor, because the evidence is overwhelming that Woodson's actions met the standard. He saved more than 200 lives. He worked for 30 hours while wounded. He performed battlefield surgery under fire. He pulled drowning men from the sea while being shot at. He returned to combat after being evacuated. By any objective measure, these actions warrant the Medal of Honor. But bureaucracy remains an obstacle. The Medal of Honor requires an act of Congress when awarded long after the fact, particularly when documentation is incomplete. Senator Van Hollen has introduced multiple bills. Each has gained support. Each has stalled. In April 2022, the Army named a health clinic at Rock Island Arsenal in Illinois the Waverly B. Woodson Jr. Army Health Clinic. It was the first military facility named after him, a recognition of his medical service both in war and in civilian life. On July 12, 2024, the city of Philadelphia renamed a section of 60th Street as Waverly B. Woodson Jr. Way, honoring the hometown hero who had never sought such honor. In June 2024, National Geographic premiered a documentary titled Erased No Color of Valor, which told Woodson's story and the broader story of Black soldiers denied recognition in World War II. The documentary featured interviews with military historians, civil rights leaders, and Woodson's family. It made clear that the failure to award the Medal of Honor was not about missing documentation. It was about a country that had never fully acknowledged the contributions and sacrifices of its Black soldiers. We will probably never know with absolute certainty why Waverly Woodson did not receive the Medal of Honor in 1945 or in the decades that followed. The documentation is incomplete. The witnesses are dead. The commanders who made the decisions are long gone, but we can draw reasonable conclusions from the broader pattern of discrimination. 0 Black soldiers received the Medal of Honor for World War II until 1997, and even then, the study that led to those awards missed Woodson's case entirely. The barriers were systematic. Recommendations from Black units were scrutinized more harshly. Eyewitness testimony from Black soldiers carried less weight. White commanders who advocated for Black soldiers often saw their recommendations downgraded or blocked. And the final decision-makers operated within a culture that simply did not see Black heroism as equal to white heroism. The result was a systematic denial of recognition that lasted generations. Even now, with overwhelming evidence, with bipartisan political support, with military historians and generals all agreeing Woodson deserves the Medal of Honor, bureaucratic requirements for documentation that was destroyed in a fire continue to present obstacles. If this case involved anything other than race, would the outcome have been different? The answer is self-evident. Yet Waverly Woodson's story also reveals something transcendent about human character. On Omaha Beach, in that crater that served as his aid station, bleeding from his own wounds and working under fire, he treated every soldier who came to him without regard to race or rank. White soldiers, Black soldiers, officers, enlisted men, Americans, British. He asked only, "Where are you hurt and how can I help?" That is the true measure of heroism, not the medals or recognition, but the simple act of helping another human being in need regardless of personal cost. The white soldiers Woodson saved went home to their families and lived their lives, many probably never knowing their medic was Black or never thinking about it. And that is exactly how it should be. In that moment on that beach, the only thing that mattered was humanity itself. Woodson understood this instinctively, which is why he never became bitter and never campaigned for recognition. He knew what he had done was right, medals or no medals. This understanding points to the most important lesson of Waverly Woodson's story. The lesson is about character and what it means to be truly heroic. When that shell hit his landing craft and shrapnel tore through his body, Woodson could have stayed down and no one would have blamed him. Instead, he got up, grabbed his medical bag, and went to work. When the pain became unbearable after hours of continuous labor, he could have stopped and passed his duties to another medic. Instead, he kept going. When he saw men drowning in surf raked by machine gun fire, he could have stayed on the beach and no one would have called him a coward. Instead, he ran into the water, and when after 30 hours his body finally collapsed and doctors told him his war was over, he could have accepted it. Instead, he asked to return to his unit. This is character. This is who Waverly Woodson was. Not a man seeking glory or recognition, but a man who understood his duty and fulfilled it beyond any reasonable expectation. Today, efforts continue to secure the Medal of Honor for Waverly Woodson. His widow Joanne, now in her late 90s, continues to advocate. Senator Van Hollen continues pushing legislation through Congress. Military historians continue searching for additional documentation. The First Army continues championing his cause. There is widespread recognition that an injustice occurred and must be corrected. But the medal remains elusive, and bureaucratic requirements remain obstacles. Yet the fight continues. Not really for a medal, but for justice. It is about finally acknowledging that black soldiers in World War II performed extraordinary acts of heroism and deserve the same recognition as their white counterparts. It is about correcting the historical record so future generations know the full story of D-Day, including the nearly 2,000 African American troops who landed on those beaches. It is about honoring a man who embodied the very best of what it means to serve, to sacrifice and to save lives at the risk of your own. His story reminds us that courage comes in all colors, and that heroism is not about seeking recognition, but about doing what is right when it matters most. Waverly Woodson saved more than 200 men in 30 hours while bleeding from his own wounds. He pulled drowning soldiers from the sea. He performed battlefield surgery under fire. He worked without rest until his body gave out. And when it was over, he asked for nothing. He simply went back to work. This is the story of America's forgotten hero. A man who proved that on the beaches of Normandy under fire when it mattered most. The only thing that separated the living from the dead was the skill and courage of one medic who refused to give up. A man who, despite being denied the recognition he deserved, never stopped being who he was, a healer, a helper, a hero, Waverly Bernard Woodson Jr. The Distinguished Service Cross recognizes his valor, but the fight for the Medal of Honor continues. It will continue until justice is finally, fully served. As Senator Van Hollen said, "It is never too late to say thank you. It is never too late to right a historic wrong."